Comrades, first of all, thanks very much for the intro, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak at what I think has been a very successful conference. It was about, I think, 150 years ago, somebody wrote about the increasing economic independence of nations. We now glibly call that globalisation. And my first point is that I think it's increasingly clear from all of the speeches we've heard from the top table in this final session, and I would argue increasingly clear amongst union members, that the idea and concept of international solidarity is not some nice idea, but is increasingly a question of political and practical necessity. Now, from a working class perspective, the last 30 years have been pretty difficult. I'm not talking about England's World Cup record. I'm talking about the fact that, you know, the point being that from the Reagan-Thatcher years onwards, you know, we've been told that this high-octane neoliberal model, where we've seen from a UK perspective a decimation of the manufacturing capacity, an argument that says an expanded financial sector based on wild speculation and a massive explosion of credit. We're told public sector run on US business school model, the privatisation of public utilities, a weakened trade union movement tied up in what Tony Blair approvingly described as the most repressive anti-union laws in Western Europe. We were told that all the problems of boom and bust even had been solved, and this was the route to economic prosperity. Well, it always was a con, and that con was exposed by the biggest financial crash since 1929. But what's become clear since that crash, that momentous month from the middle of September to the middle of October in 2008, is that nobody should still believe that the neoliberal project is over and dead and buried. After the massive bailout to the banks and the speculators of what later transpired to be our money, after the dust has settled, neoliberalism has come roaring back, and the budget crisis is now used as the pretext by the ruling class, not just in Britain but across Europe, as the pretext for even deeper cuts in public expenditure, a rush to privatise what's left of the public sector, and effectively an attempt to dismantle all the social advances won in the post-war years, that something that even Thatcher and Blair didn't dare attempt. But as always, it's particularly at a time of economic crisis, it's the workers that are expected to pay the price of it. But as always, it's trade unions that stand in the way of the government and the employers' agenda. I just quote from a recent Financial Times editorial, the 21st of May. It opened up with the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats are united in their enthusiasm for civil society, but the full terms of their coalition, released yesterday, reveal that one set of voluntary organisations should be very afraid indeed. Before the election, the coalition parties aim to avoid a direct confrontation with the British trade union movement. They are now braced for a pitched battle. The coalition must prepare itself for the battle ahead, because organised labour has seen off British governments before. Now that is the voice of the ruling class that is telling us and telling our members quite clearly what their intention is. Now, of course, it's why the ruling class threw all the forces of the state to defeat the NUM and inflict a defeat as a lesson to the rest of us. It's why we've seen an upsurge in hostile articles in the media against the BA strikers. It's why we've seen the intervention of the courts to render effectively the democratic right to take industrial action obsolete. But of course, I think all of us understand we never expect to see anything favourable to the interests of trade unionism in the media. I think we're all, hard-bitten and realistic people. We've all, as somebody once said, been reading the obituary of trade unionism since 6 agricultural labourers first gathered under a tree at Tolpuddle. Now, we may not be, from a UK perspective, certainly in recent years, prone to some of the upsurge and the faster-moving strikes we've seen on the continent, but it's always worth remembering that the British trade union movement is not just the oldest, but arguably one of the most resilient trade union movements across the planet. It still has 7 million members with an enormous latent power, and it comes down to organisations like the Shop Stewards Network, like rank and file networks developed in each individual union, about applying, not just capturing posts, but building a genuine rank and file to infuse the activity of trade unionism with the socialist politics that's needed. That's the way to win the hearts and minds, and most importantly, that's the way to ensure that the trade union movement uses its power. Now, reference has been made by a number of speakers about the point that the cuts are not necessary. I mean, in 1931, it was the coalition government. The sheep's clothing was provided by Ramsay MacDonald and the Labour Party. The sheep's clothing now is provided by, Uncle Vince Cable and the Liberals. But even from a capitalist perspective, these cuts are not necessary. All sorts of economists are warning about the adverse consequences. Where, God help us, even the international bond markets are now nervous about the consequences of precipitate cuts in public expenditure. Even the White House is advising governments across Europe about the damaging consequences of cuts. That's before, as Matt Rapp referred to, the fact, as a result of the work that we've done with the Tax Justice Network, finding that there's between 125 to 140 billion pounds lost each year to the public exchequer as a result of tax avoidance measures of the super rich and the wealthiest companies in our society. That's before you even talk about tax evasion. And of course we estimate that somewhere in the region of 90 to 100 billion in uncollected tax, and the very department that's responsible for collecting it, where PCS organise, is on the receiving end of arbitrary job cuts and office closures. But in challenging the economic fallacies and political fallacies that underlie this government's strategy, equally importantly, we've got to challenge the view that cuts are in any way inevitable. I would like to think that PCS, in its small way, without overstating it, has shown what is possible when a union is prepared to speak and act for its members, even most recently over the attempt to rip up accrued rights under our compensation scheme. The pleasant surprise of finding a court that rules in our favour, but without the industrial action we would not have been able to convincingly persuade the judge and the government that they hadn't consulted and this was an attempt to damage our members' rights. This government have no mandate. I don't believe they have public support. And again, tucked away in a Financial Times article in March of this year was an article bemoaning the fact that the public haven't come round yet to the compelling case for cuts.